Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the Trump administration has announced that the United States will pull out of a nuclear arms control treaty with Russia that's been in place since the Cold War, sparking fears of a new arms race. President Trump accused Moscow of violating the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with impunity by secretly developing banned missiles, a claim Russia has strongly denied. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, reports.
The first agreement ever to eliminate an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons. We have made history.
It was a time of hope, détente and nuclear disarmament. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, signed by Presidents Gorbachev and Reagan in 1987, significantly reduced tension in the Cold War. Fast forward 32 years.
For years, Russia has violated the terms of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty without remorse. To this day, Russia remains in material breach of its treaty obligations not to produce, possess, or flight test a ground-launched intermediate-range cruise missile system with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers.
The Russians deny that they're cheating. This missile, they say, doesn't go that far. But the Americans are now suspending the treaty for 6 months. And if Russia doesn't do something about it, they'll pull out completely.
We provided Russia an ample window of time to mend its ways and for Russia to honor its commitment. Tomorrow that time runs out. Russia has refused to take any steps to return real and verifiable compliance over these 60 days.
US ship-based missiles that can have nuclear warheads don't come under the treaty, so the Americans already have an advantage over the Russians. And today's announcement may lead to a new arms race. So why? The answer may lie in Beijing, not Moscow. China is modernizing its military and has developed intermediate-range nuclear missiles. They're not bound by any treaty. And the Americans see China, not Russia, as the coming military threat. The Russians say they regret the US decision, but they're now free to extend their missile range.
This game is over. The Americans are sure to finally pull out of the treaty. This will be a serious blow to the international arms control system and the system of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.
Maybe we should be nostalgic for the Cold War, when everyone had a proper fear of nuclear conflagration. We're entering a new period of uncertainty and danger.
Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Patricia Lewis, an arms control expert from the Chatham House think tank. She worked as a consultant on the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty in the 80s and became director of the UN's Institute for Disarmament Research, as well as playing a leading role in treaty verification. Do you believe this means we are heading into a new era of escalation?
It looks like it, but it's very hard to understand the reasons behind it. You know, we're no longer in a Cold War. We have a completely different relationship between the East and the West. As Lindsay rightly says, we have a rising China. We should be looking to constrain China, to bring China into the INF Treaty and to hold Russia to account.
But if Russia is flouting the treaty and China's not part of it anyway, so it can do what it wants, I mean, won't America rightly say, well, more fool us? Why are we obeying the rule that nobody else is?
Yes, that's an understandable thing. But, you know, when you have a national law, if people break it, you don't just say, well, let's get rid of the law. What you do is you force people into court, you force them to be held to account.
But you can't force China into the court.
No, you can't, but you could create a condition whereby China could join an international treaty like that. And in fact, this has been proposed over a number of years, and you could go down that path of mutual constraint. And maybe that's what will happen. But right now, to pull out before nothing else is in place seems to be rather unfortunate, because, you know, what Russia now has been given a gift. You know, they can just do what they like. No one will call them to account anymore, and they can blame President Trump.
Can Russia really compete with either the United States and China when it comes to spending and scale?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by spending and scale. You know, developing nuclear weapons is expensive, but it's not as expensive as developing lots and lots of conventional forces. Russia is already going down this pathway. Of course, Congress may well tie the hands now of President Trump. You know, we have 2 measures being put down both in the Senate and in Congress right now just to do that. So, you know, he's got his own domestic problems.
I mean, Lindsay raised at the end of her piece, you know, the idea of nostalgia for a Cold War when everybody was driven by fear to some degree. And that led to the treaty process and those great meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev. I mean, you know, is there an argument that a little bit of fear might help?
I think a realization and a remembering and a reminding of what these weapons can do, the humanitarian impact of them, the actual scale of the destruction of nuclear weapons wouldn't go amiss right now, and to get ourselves back into some serious arms control in the old-fashioned way.
I mean, the other problem is the sort of breakdown of other international institutions, isn't it? I mean, there is no international organisation, certainly not the UN, that commands the respect of Washington, Moscow and Beijing.
You know, and you know, the Security Council does, however. The UN Security Council is a place where China, Russia and the United States still put a lot of energy and still take it very seriously. And so I think this is maybe now where we need to focus and bring them all together and get them talking in a completely different way.
Patricia Lewis, thank you very much.
The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today announced that America is suspending the Nuclear Arms Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev famously signed over 31 years ago and heralded a less fractious time between the East and West. Pompeo warned Russia in December that it had been found in material breach of the treaty that resulted in the destruction of 2,692 missiles belonging to both countries by 1991. Now, though, the personalities are very different and other powers are also in the mix.
It was the moment when the world started believing the Cold War was thawing, when Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, Treaty in 1987. It was the first arms control agreement to ban an entire class of weapons, ground-launched cruise missiles with a range between 300 and 3,300 miles. But now America, supported by NATO, is getting ready to back out of that treaty.
We will provide Russia and the other treaty parties with formal notice that the United States is withdrawing from the INF Treaty, effective in 6 months. If Russia does not return to full and verifiable compliance with the treaty within this 6-month period, by verifiably destroying its INF-violating missiles, their launchers, and associated equipment, the treaty will terminate.
NATO says that Russia's new Novator 9M729 cruise missile, launched from a ground mobile platform, breaches the agreement. But Russia insists its range falls short of the lower limits specified in the treaty. And they accuse America of breaking the treaty on a false pretext, so that they can develop their own new weapons.
All we are saying is give peace a chance.
The INF Treaty was originally designed to end the proliferation of ground-launched medium-range missiles in Europe, like the Pershing II ballistic missiles that sparked long-running protests at Greenham Common. So, how successful was it? The INF Treaty marked the beginning of a big decline in nuclear proliferation, with over 3,000 warheads destroyed by 1991. But after George W. Bush took America out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, progress slowed. In 2007, President Putin declared that the treaty no longer served Russia's interests, and in 2014, Russia allegedly tested a ground-launched missile in contravention of the agreement. Of the 9 nuclear powers, the US, the UK, Russia, Israel and France have all been reducing or maintaining the size of their arsenals. But Pakistan, India, North Korea and, most notably, China are believed to be producing more. As tensions between America and China grow, some analysts believe America wants to leave the INF Treaty so it can be free to counter China's nuclear ambitions. But there is no suggestion that the Pentagon currently has a particular weapons system it wants to develop that would be barred by the treaty. Russia now has 6 months to respond to America's gambit. If the INF Treaty falls apart, could we see a return to the nuclear brinkmanship that we all thought had ended 30 years ago?
Well, Thomas Countryman was the Under-Secretary of State for International Security Affairs and Non-Proliferation from 2011 to 2017. He's now the chairman of the Arms Control Association, which works to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons. He joins us now. Thomas, thank you very much for joining us tonight. First of all, what is the significance of this move today, and who stands to lose most?
Well, it's significant in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. In the short term, we have to ask whether this important treaty, which matters to both American and European national security, can be preserved. If it can't, then in the medium term, we have to think about what military and diplomatic steps NATO can take to reduce this new Russian threat to NATO's territory. And in the long term, we need to be concerned about the entire future of arms control, and in particular the risk that this could pose to the New START treaty, which limits the most dangerous long-range nuclear weapons.
Now, this is a new short-range weapon. What is the most likely target? I mean, is Putin simply taunting with the idea, or is there a likely target in Europe?
Well, the Russian military has been dissatisfied with the INF Treaty since it was signed in 1987, believing that it took away a valuable lever for Russia in any potential conflict with NATO. Now, the new weapon, with a range greater than the 500-kilometer limit specified by the INF Treaty, is a new means of exerting pressure and leverage on the European allies in NATO. And so if they can keep these weapons, if the treaty goes away, and if at the same time Russia can credibly blame Washington for letting the treaty fall apart, it's a double victory for Russia, and it's a new military threat that NATO has to contend with.
So in your view, is there a way for Russia to back off in this, and is there a way for America to step away? After all, I mean, you were very much involved in this until Donald Trump summarily just dismissed you as soon as he came in. I think you were on board a plane to a meeting on nuclear weapons. I mean, has this been a kind of cavalier move, or are they both going to step back at the last moment?
I don't think it's a cavalier move, but I also don't think it is a wise move. It will be difficult for either side to step back from positions they've dug into. But there has been work by a group called the Deep Cuts Commission, which includes experts from the U.S., Russia, and Germany, that has proposed to both sides on-site verification, reciprocal verification of the complaints that each side has made about the other. That would use the principle that was most firmly established by the INF Treaty, and that was the major innovation in arms control, which is on-site inspections. And in order to do this in a reciprocal basis, it could allow for this treaty to be preserved without Russia having to give in to a U.S. ultimatum that the only means of preserving the treaty is for Russia to admit that it's a violation and destroy all the missiles.
So what do you make of the argument that says that actually Donald Trump, maybe not NATO, but Donald Trump would be quite happy to see this fall because he wants to look further afield to China, for example, to North Korea, and wants the ability to develop more weapons that would actually be targeted at them? What do you make of that argument?
Well, there are two reasons that are, I think, behind the statements made today by Secretary Pompeo. One is concern about China, which, unbound by any kind of intermediate forces treaty, has built hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, missiles in this category. And it's understandable that the U.S. military would like to have the capability to equal that, to deter the use of Chinese missiles. But there's a second category as well of motivation for this, and this is the deep-seated hostility of the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, towards nearly any arms control agreement that the U.S. has negotiated in the last 40 years. He played a key role in the U.S. pulling out of the ABM Treaty in 2002, in ending the Comprehensive Framework Agreement with North Korea, and of course, most recently, in terminating the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. So I think he's very happy to see the U.S. get out of the INF Treaty, a treaty he has never liked, and I'm very concerned that his next target might be the New START treaty.
Thomas Cruncherman, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Following yesterday's announcement by the United States that it was suspending its participation in a key pact with Russia over nuclear weapons, Russia has announced that it will do the same. President Putin said Russia would stop observing the Cold War treaty agreed in 1987 to hold nuclear ambitions in check and now start developing new weapons. From Moscow, Steve Rosenberg sent this report.
At the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin and his ministers sent a clear message to Washington over the INF Treaty. You intend to pull out, do you? Well, two can play at that game.
Our response will be symmetrical. Our US partners announced that they are suspending their participation in the INF Treaty. So we are suspending it too.
And there was more. Moscow, President Putin said, would develop new weapons, including a land-based version of this cruise missile, and missiles more than 5 times the speed of sound. It's a far cry from US-Russian cooperation 3 decades ago, when Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty. It eliminated a whole class of short and medium-range missiles and became a cornerstone of European security. But the chill in relations is palpable. It's beginning to feel like the Cold War is back. President Putin said the one thing he didn't want was Russia being dragged into a costly new arms race. But with both America and Russia now having suspended the INF Treaty, that is a huge blow to East-West arms control. The INF Treaty is breaking apart, and America blames Russia.
Russia has jeopardized the United States' security interest, and we can no longer be restricted by the treaty while Russia shamelessly violates it.
America says these Russian missiles violated the INF Treaty. Moscow denies it and claims Washington broke the agreement. A high-stakes blame game for the two biggest nuclear powers. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
President Putin warns Russia will develop new nuclear missiles after suspending its involvement in a nuclear arms treaty just days after the US did the same. Good evening. Where President Trump leads, it would appear his Russian counterpart follows. President Vladimir Putin has announced that Russia is suspending its involvement in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty signed by the USSR and the United States back in 1987. It effectively banned the use of short and medium-range missiles by both countries. America has long accused Russia of violating the treaty. It suspended its involvement on Friday. So, a new chill between the old Cold War enemies? The battle to beat the actual freeze here continues as roads are blocked and motorists stranded in the snow. There are warnings of sub-zero temperatures in parts of Scotland and England tonight. Universities, bastions of free speech or centres of censorship. New guidance for student bodies on how they handle controversial speakers. And as the BFI marks 100 years of depicting life for people with disabilities in film, we ask, is enough changing for people who say too often they're left out of the picture? Now, Russia has suspended its involvement in a Cold War-era nuclear missile treaty amid fears of a new arms race. The move is in response to the United States' announcement yesterday that they were pulling out of the same treaty, claiming Russia has repeatedly violated its terms. Moscow strongly denies that, but President Putin today said Russia would begin developing new missiles immediately. Paul McNamara reports.
It's a nation that revels in military might and ostentatious displays of power. So the Russian response to an international dressing down over a 32-year-old nuclear deal was never going to take long. This morning, it came. Vladimir Putin summoning his foreign minister, defense minister and the TV cameras for a stage-managed meeting.
We will provide a mirror-like response. Our American partners have declared that they suspend their participation in the deal. We are suspending it as well. They have announced that they will engage in research and development programs. We will do the same.
The president said he didn't want to get involved in a costly arms race, but in the same breath also gave the green light to start work creating some new nuclear missiles. Missiles that have been banned since these two signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987. These weapons were seen as particularly destabilising, as they only take a few minutes to reach their targets, leaving no time for decision makers. It was a treaty that significantly reduced tensions in the Cold War, a treaty the US has now accused Russia of violating.
I hope that we're able to get everybody in a very big and beautiful room and do a new treaty that would be much better. But, because certainly I would like to see that. But you have to have everybody adhere to it. And you have a certain side that almost pretends it doesn't exist.
While foreign policy has been somewhat erratic during this presidency, this is one decision with international backing.
For us, it is clear that Russia has violated this treaty, and that's why we must talk to Russia.
This was echoed by the head of NATO, who said today all European allies agree with the United States. One nation not bound by any such treaty is China, who last year took part in this joint military exercise with Russia, the largest exercise of its type for decades. The US sees China as the military threat of the future, and China's swelling military has been able to arm themselves with the intermediate range missiles that the US can't. Russia denies any of its missiles violate the treaty, but the US say they have 6 months to return to full compliance. 6 months to save a treaty that has helped keep the peace for more than 3 decades.